The warrior's champion. John 3:30. He must become greater, and I must become less. Hebrews 12:1-3. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up, and let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. Think of all the hostility he endured from sinful people. Then you won't become weary and give up. Most stories start at the beginning, but not this story, not the story of Caleb. I shall start his story where it is yet to begin, for I can see him struggling up the path, one weary step in front of the other, eyes downcast, heart broken, his hands clutching on to hope, a hope that he will make it at last to the city of the great champion. But more than that, hope that the great champion will welcome him into the city. After all, the great champion had called Caleb to be a warrior, but doubts of all he was not seeped into Caleb's heart and through eyes, even as tears escaped down his face. He was not one to cry, but as he looked upward at the steep, narrow path in front of him, and all that lay between him and the city he longed for so deeply, he could not help but let his eyes also glance down at all that he was not. And one thing was painfully apparent. He was not a warrior. Not the kind of warrior he had always dreamed of being, and certainly not the warrior he was when he was younger. A small smile tugged at Caleb's mouth as he remembered the days when he stood so tall and confident in his shiny armor. He fought valiantly against the enemies that came against him in battle. His countrymen had applauded him and cheered him on when he marched out, and they welcomed him in with a hero's welcome when he returned. What had happened? He wondered to himself, why do I appear less and less like a warrior? Will the great champion even recognize me? I am covered in rags. I am poor and destitute. I am despised by all who know me, and even I hate myself, for I am not like the great champion. If anything, the longer I have served him, the more I have drifted from looking anything like him. Caleb's heart sank, and his knees also sank down onto the dusty pathway. A lifetime of memories passed before his mind's eyes as he knelt there. Caleb remembered the first time he had met the great champion. He had been so young and eager to take on any enemy, no matter how fierce. Caleb had been wearing his armor that he always spent hours shining and polishing until it gleamed in the sunlight. He wanted to ensure that no one ever mistook him for anything but what he so deeply longed to be, a warrior. As a child, Caleb had heard the stories of the great champion, how he had valiantly left the city where his father, the mighty king, ruled, and came to rescue his people, who had been captured by a terrible enemy. The great champion had even given up his life as a ransom for his own, and by his own wounds had healed his chosen ones. Caleb had decided from a young age to do valiant things just like the great champion. He had made mistakes and failed, but he was not one to quit or give up. He would get back up and try again, and so he did. The great champion had sought Caleb out on the eve of a great battle. Caleb was preparing to march out into the battle wearing his armor and fight the battle the next day. The evening was cool and dusk had settled over the camp. Caleb was sitting by a dying fire when he heard footsteps approach. The great champion stood in the shadows, but when he called Caleb's name, Caleb knew exactly who it was, for no one had ever said his name like that before. "Caleb, I have chosen you to be my warrior," the great champion whispered through the twilight. "You are not your own anymore, for I have bought you with a price. I will send you out to fight the battles of my father, the mighty king." Caleb's heart pounded so hard within his chest, for he had longed for such a noble calling as this, and now he could hardly contain his excitement and joy. "Oh, great champion, what an honor you give me to be your warrior. I will do all within my power to serve you and your father and to bring you honor." "The way is not easy, Caleb, and I will require everything from you. You must lay everything down and surrender your very life to me." "I will do anything you say." Caleb's voice was filled with eagerness. The great champion was silent for a few moments, but then he asked a strange question, or so Caleb thought. "Who are you?" "Well, I am Caleb, once a warrior of my own heart, but now your warrior. I will serve you with bravery and courage. I am trained in war and will fight valiantly for you." Caleb thought that the great champion's eyes appeared to be filled with sadness, a sadness that was also mixed with the joy of a sure expectation. Caleb, the great champion, was about to ask another question that would unnerve Caleb even more than his first question. "Who am I?" You are the great champion, the son of the mighty king. I have heard of all the valiant deeds you did, and how great you are. You are the ruler of the whole land, the one who is above all." The great champion nodded in agreement, but his face told Caleb that he had been waiting for a different answer, an answer that he also knew he would not receive yet, but even so had longed to hear. "Caleb, I want you to fight for me in the battle tomorrow. But first you must do one thing." Caleb knelt to the ground as he felt the seriousness of his calling. "Anything, great champion, I will do anything for you." "Caleb, you must give me your boots. For you are not to enter into battle in your own strength, but in the power I give. I give to you the peace of my message of hope, for I have rescued my people, and the peace of this salvation shall be that which covers your feet, and lead you out in the way that I have set you." Caleb swallowed as the full realization of what the great champion said weighed heavily upon his heart. How was he to go into battle without his boots? How was he to advance against his enemy without the boots that enabled him to run and climb over the obstacles in his path? What warrior ever went about without his boots on? Caleb licked his dry lips and tried not to let his growing horror show. He longed to protest and to make excuses to the great champion, but he had just pledged to do anything. So he slowly and reluctantly took off his boots and handed them to the great champion. The great champion took them and smiled at Caleb. "Now follow me." The next day the battle was fierce, and Caleb felt the loss of his boots deeply. For not only did he struggle in engaging the enemy, but his fellow warriors looked at him incredulously. As they shook their heads and pressed on across the battlefield, Caleb knew that they did not understand, and his own heart did not understand why. His feet were wounded over and over again. As he tried to pursue his enemy, he felt like he was accomplishing so little compared to the other warriors. After the smoke of that first battle lifted, Caleb bandaged his hurting, bloodied feet and tried to keep up with the rest of the army as they marched up the narrow path that led to the next battle. Caleb tried not to think of how badly his feet hurt, but instead tried to imagine what it would be like to finally make it to the city of the great champion. He wondered what it would be like to be welcomed into that great city, and if he would receive a hero's welcome like he had always dreamed of receiving. Caleb tried not to worry too much about the strange looks that the other warriors had given him as he marched into battle without his boots. As long as no one looked at his feet, they would still think that he looked like a valiant warrior clad in shining armor and an undefeatable sword. Day by day, battle by battle, and step by step, Caleb pressed onward to the city of the great champion. It was on another evening, though, before a battle that the great champion came to Caleb as the warrior gazed out across a dark valley, the dark valley that he and the rest of the army would be descending into the following day. Caleb, the great champion, stood hidden in the darkness, but his voice rang out clear and distinct. Great champion! Caleb fell to his knees and felt his heart lift with pride at the knowledge that the great champion had come to meet him again. Yet again, to Caleb's confusion, the great champion set about to ask the same two strange questions that he had before. Who are you? I am Caleb. I am a warrior, and you have called me to fight the battles of your father, the mighty king. I have been fighting faithfully for you, great champion. Even though I have had no boots for my feet, I have still stood fast for you, even in the face of adversity. Indeed you have, Caleb. The great champion took a step closer and was just visible to Caleb. And who am I? Caleb swallowed before answering. He did not understand why the great champion would ask him these questions. You are the great champion, the son of the mighty king, the rescuer of your people, the one who is above all things. Caleb, another fierce battle awaits you tomorrow. The great champion's voice was low and held a secret sorrow. You must remember that no matter what, I am always with you, even if you cannot see me, and especially if you cannot feel me near. I am always near to the ones I love, and I love you, Caleb, and I have rescued you. Caleb nodded. He felt something growing in his heart like a small seed planted in dark soil that must be left to grow in the secret place. A seed of the great champion's love had been planted in the soil of Caleb's heart, even before this day. But like a tender plant, Caleb had not even noticed it growing. But Caleb, when I called you to myself, I told you that you would have to give up everything for me. You must do one thing before you go out to battle tomorrow. Caleb hesitated for a moment in his heart as he remembered what had been required of him the last time that the great champion had said those words. Yes, great champion, I will do whatever you ask. His answer was not as exuberant as last time, nor was it bursting with the eagerness that he had felt last time. Caleb, the great champion's voice was filled with a deep compassion as he whispered through the night, You must give me your shield. You must not rely upon your own sight to protect you from the enemy as you would use your human eyes to ward off the attacks of your enemy, but you must step out in faith as you trust my own hand to protect you and lead you onward even to my glorious city, where you shall live forever with me and my Father and all those who love me. Caleb shuddered as his grip on his shield tightened. Not my shield. His heart revolted inside of himself at the thought of relinquishing his shield. He was used to gripping the cool, hard metal of the shield in his hand as he faced the battlefield. He knew that the other warriors would mock and ridicule him for throwing his shield away. Yet Caleb felt compelled to set his shield down at the feet of the great champion who loved him. How could he refuse to give up something for the sake of the one who had loved him and called him forth? As quietly as the great champion had appeared, so he also departed, leaving Caleb alone and discouraged. His gaze once again drifted down towards the valley that he would be going into the next day, and suddenly he felt overcome. How could he make it through such a dark valley without his shield to protect him? from the enemy's fiery arrows? How could he press through all the challenges that lay ahead if he had no shield on which to rely? Both times that Caleb had encountered the great champion, it had required more and more from him, as if part of his own heart died every time he was in the great champion's presence. He felt a strange feeling sweep over his heart as he sat there in the darkness. He felt as though his dreams and hopes and longings for his life were slipping through his fingers. He sensed that he was not becoming a great warrior, and it seemed instead he was actually going in the opposite direction, for what is a warrior without his boots and shield? Caleb faced the battle and deep valley, and as he had thought, his fellow warriors mocked and ridiculed him for his stupidity and throwing away his shield and boots. He also felt the terrible blows from battle that his trusty shield surely would have blocked. However, Caleb remained faithful and did not give up, even though his heart felt low and discouraged. After the battle, Caleb once again bandaged his wounds and kept journeying towards the city of the great champion. Little by little, he made his way towards the city that seemed so far and out of reach. And once again, after journeying quite a long ways down the path, without his shield or boots, Caleb was met by the great champion, who once again asked him the strange yet familiar questions. Caleb answered the questions, and the great champion once again required Caleb to give up another piece of his beloved armor. Over and over again, Caleb felt the loss of all he had once held dear: his belt that bound his armor together and held his other weapons of ability, strength, and health; his helmet that distinguished him amongst common men and set him apart as a warrior, which had provided protection from the enemy; his sword, which he had long since wielded in battle, but now set aside for the sake of the great champion. Yet he held on to one last piece of armor, the one he hoped the great champion would not require from him, and that was his breastplate. This was his last link to what he once was as a warrior, his only way of showing those around him that he truly was a warrior. In his heart, Caleb clung to this piece of armor so fiercely that he did not know what he would do if the great champion were to come to him once more and tell him to lay it down as he had the other pieces of armor. One day, as Caleb was coming to a particularly steep part of the narrow path, he noticed a dark shadow up ahead as the narrow path turned around a bend. However, before he came to the shadow, he was surprised to be met by the great champion. After he answered the great champion's questions, Caleb sensed that what he had long since dreaded was about to happen. He was sure that the great champion would want him to surrender the last piece of his armor, and it made him tremble inside. "Caleb, you are about to face a battle that is not like any battle you have encountered before. You will not come out of it the same. For indeed I will be sending you into a fire today that will consume you and will strip you of your dreams, your reputation, and all that is of this earth. But hold on to this hope that you shall never lose that which is truly important and real. You shall never lose my love." Suddenly, fear crept into Caleb's heart as he felt the depth of his insufficiency. Once he had stood before the great champion and felt confident in his abilities as a warrior. He had eagerly anticipated the battles that he expected to face for the great champion, but not anymore. Little by little, Caleb had been stripped of the things that he had relied upon, and now all that he had left was his scratched and tarnished breastplate. Once he had taken such pride in polishing his armor till it shone, so that all would see that he was a great warrior. But now the realization was beginning to sink into Caleb's heart, that he was not the warrior that he had dreamed of being, or imagined himself being. "Caleb," the great champion interrupted Caleb's thoughts, "you must do one thing before you go and face this battle ahead. You must give me your breastplate. And though you have held it dear for so long and counted on it for your deliverance time and time again, I want you to know and believe and live out the truth that I alone am your deliverer. I alone cover you. I alone am sufficient for all that you need. I alone am the one who has saved you and rescued you from your enemy. You must come to the end of yourself, Caleb, and this can only happen through my refining fire. Trust me and know that my love for you shall never fail, and I will be with you through this fierce battle ahead. Though you cannot see me or feel me, I will never leave you for a moment. Caleb felt his heart being swept away by the great champion's words as his mind tried to make sense of what was happening. His eyes clouded and his shoulders hung weakly as he took off his breastplate. He looked at it and wondered what would become of himself now that he no longer had one piece of his warrior's armor to cling to. He was not sure how he would go out into battle without his breastplate, protecting his heart from the enemy's attack. Yet he remembered that the great champion had told him on that very first day when he had come to him that he was no longer his own because the great champion had bought his very life and rescued him from the enemy. Caleb laid the breastplate down at the great champion's feet. The great champion seemed to disappear swiftly as soon as Caleb had laid down his breastplate, and a thick mist swirled around Caleb that caused his heart to feel a deep sadness within. The dark shadow that Caleb had previously seen before meeting the great champion now seemed to envelop him. Within the darkness and mist, Caleb felt the battle's fierce heat curl around his body as doubts and fears clawed at his heart. He was sure that he could hear voices calling out to him, unless his own heart was accusing him and mocking his loneliness as he creeped along the pathway. "Look at you now," a sneering laugh called out to him. "What kind of warrior are you? You certainly don't look like a warrior, and you couldn't belong to the great champion when you look like a beggar." Another accusing laugh snorted out next. "Did you see how everyone looked at you as you walked down the narrow path? They don't think that you really belong to the great champion. None of them do. They must surely think that you have no place in the city of the great champion." The first voice whispered starkly, "You should just turn around. You will never be welcomed into the city of the great champion. You are not a warrior. You are weak and pitiful. Surely a warrior of the great champion would actually look like a warrior." Caleb's heart seemed to break into a million pieces each painful step that he took as the voices bombarded him with their accusations. The most painful part of it was that he knew that they were right. He did not look like a warrior. He was everything that they said he was, and everything in him shouted for himself to turn around and not take another step further. "Do you really think that the great champion wants to see you like this?" A quiet voice whispered into the depths of Caleb's heart. "Does he really love you when you are such a disgrace?" The accusations tormented Caleb step by step as he walked into the fiercest battle he had ever felt before, and he felt a fear rise within his heart because he had no armor, no shield, and no sword to wield against his foe. He was helpless, and all seemed hopeless. In that exact moment of painful realization, Caleb's eyes suddenly caught sight of a huge, ugly dragon swooping in from the dark sky. It was red like blood and covered in scales that were as sharp as jagged rocks. Caleb looked for something to hide behind, but he was out in the open as he stood on the narrow path, and the only trees and rocks would require him to stray from the path. The dragon roared as it landed ahead of where Caleb stood. "How dare you seek the city of the great champion? You belong to me, and I will have what is rightfully mine. Your blood is mine to devour, and I will do so this very day. You are indeed a pitiful sight, and I would not think that the great champion will even miss seeing you ever again." The dragon breathed out fire and smoke that burned Caleb's eyes. Caleb was frozen where he stood on the pathway, and his lips were cracked and dry. He knew he could do nothing to save himself from this awful creature. The heat of the dragon's breath singed Caleb's clothes and hair. The dragon drew nearer, and with each fiery breath, he spewed forth the words that filled his heart. "You filthy beggar! Unclean wretch, you are clothed in rags and have no resemblance to the great champion." The dragon's breath burned through Caleb's clothes, and he could feel his skin blister as his whole body ached in agony. Caleb dropped to the ground in pain as sobs shook his entire body. Physically, he was breaking, but his heart was in greater pain as the words seemed to sear his heart and brand him with their power. Yet something unforeseen happened just as Caleb thought he would expire. He felt as though he were transported back in time. But at the same moment, he still was on the narrow path near the dragon. However, both the dragon and he became suddenly aware that someone else stood near. Someone was being beaten, whipped, and mocked. The person did not retaliate or say a word in return, but instead quietly bore the agony. Caleb gasped as he realized that this man was the great champion. He tried to rush to the man's side, but he could not move from his spot, as though what he was seeing had already taken place so long ago. To Caleb's horror, he could see the great champion's father, looking on with a heartbroken expression across his face. He spoke the word, and his son was crushed and wounded beyond recognition. Caleb began to weep into his hands as he could no longer watch the terrible sight in front of him. The great champion was covered in all the accusations that the voices and the dragon had all brought against Caleb. In that moment, Caleb looked up and could see the great champion covered in filth. And that is when the mighty king turned away. The father could no longer look upon his son, for the great champion had just taken all of his people's wretchedness upon his own heart. The great champion soon took his last breath as he shouted loudly, "It is finished!" The scene faded, and Caleb could just make out a figure stepping into view. "I will always love you. I will always be with you. I will always help you." The great champion was alive again, though he had been killed for the ransom of his people. "I have taken all of your wickedness and insufficiencies, and now you shall live in me and I in you." The darkness closed in again around Caleb as the great champion's image seemed to disappear into the mist. But his voice echoed through Caleb's heart, "Never forget that I love you, Caleb, and that I have rescued you." When the darkness finally broke and the mist lifted, Caleb found himself altogether different. He was no longer confident in his ability or his calling as a warrior. He was confident in one thing, and that was the great champion and his love for a wretched beggar like himself. His feet covered the pathway quickly as he longed more than ever to reach the city so that he could run into the great champion's arms. The path seemed to stretch on, though, mile after weary mile, and this brings us back to where my story began. Caleb's eyes are closed as he trembles from the doubts that constantly creep into his heart. How can he just go up to the city of the great champion and think that he, a wretched beggar, would be welcomed? I can see that his heart is in agony as the old fears bombard him. I only wish that Caleb could see what my heart can see. For the city of the great champion is not so far away as it was before, and even as Caleb kneels in defeat, the watchman has already spread the word that one of the great champion's warriors is drawing close to the city gate. He has fallen down upon the path. The guard calls out incredibly. He isn't getting back up, but he is so close. What shall we do? He is filled with fears and doubts that we shall not welcome him, and that the great champion himself shall not welcome him because he does not look like a warrior. The throngs of people in the city flock to the walls overlooking the narrow path that led into the city through the narrow gate. They all hold their breath as they wait to see what will happen. And as the most spectacular drama unfolding, The crowds watch in surprise as they suddenly see someone running towards the gate and down the path towards the man. Joyous gasps fill the air as the great champion pulls up his royal robes and sprints down the narrow path. His legs pump back and forth as he makes his way to Caleb. And when he reaches Caleb, the great champion stoops down and wraps Caleb in his arms. He removes the rags from Caleb's back and takes his own royal robe and puts it on Caleb. He pulls Caleb to his feet and looks into his eyes with intensity. Caleb, who are you? Caleb suddenly feels the truth seep into his being, and it sets him free. I am yours. I am weak, helpless, insufficient, and a wretch that you have saved by your great kindness. I am yours, great champion. I am your servant, and that is who I shall be forevermore. I shall always be hidden in you. The great champion's eyes fill with joy as he listens to Caleb's answer. And who am I? Caleb's eyes shine like the sun as his heart pours out into his answer. You are my champion. You are the one who has rescued me from my enemy. You have brought me to your father, the mighty king, and made me his warrior. You are my all, and you are greater than all. The great champion smiles and leads Caleb the rest of the way to the city gate, where Caleb is welcomed with exuberant cheers and shouts of acclamation as all join in rejoicing in the great champion who has led another one of his lost ones home. Thus ends Caleb's story, at least on the pages of this book. But really his story shall go on and on forever. The end.